Good morning. How is everyone? So in this video lecture today, we're going to look at the book of Job. This is going to be part one of a two-part series of videos looking at the book of Job. And today, we want to focus in on three aspects of this story. First, to understand the nature of this story, the form or structure of the story, we need to understand a little bit about the location of this story within the entirety of the Bible. Genesis is the first book in the first 5 books of the Bible called the Torah. These books were written down in final canonical form around 1000 BC. The story of Job comes from a later body of writings. Called the Ketuvim. The Genesis comes from the Torah. Tanakh, which is the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, refers to the Torah, the Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, right? So there is about 500 years difference between the writings of these stories, and even more difference between their origins and development and structure. So once that established, we look at its place in the Bible and the historical context which surrounds this story, both in terms of the writing of the story, but also historical events that it seems to relate to. Then we're going to look more specifically at the structure of this story. One, in terms of a more modern style of writing that we're going to immediately recognize as being in some ways less poetic. It has a very simple and straightforward narrative form. It is a short story that we all recognize, which starts out with a kind of exposition or prologue that establishes the main elements of the story. Then we move to the central action of the story, and then we move to the resolution and conclusion of the story, something that you're all kind of, the narrative structure that you're familiar with in a grade school. And we're going to notice that actually within this story structure, the basic umbrella of the story structure is actually different styles of writing that have been integrated. Right? So on one hand, you have a simple narrative structure. Then within that, you have a very specific dialogue structure, a back and forth dialogue between Job and his friends, and then the addition of another character, and then ultimately a dialogue between Job and his friends and God at the very end, where God emerges to kind of rectify the problem they're having. And we're going to notice that the action of the story really consists of this dialogical process, this back and forth between Job and his friends, which stands out as a distinct style of writing. It's almost theatrical or dramatic in the sense that there is very little narration there. It's almost all dialogue. And connected with that, when Job gives his responses to his friends, he gives it to them in a poetical form. And his lamentations and his responses are not simply kind of declarative statements. They're really poetry or even song. And particularly, it seems that the language of Genesis 1 through Genesis 3, but particularly Genesis 1, becomes instrumental in the kind of the reservoir of language that Job draws on in characterizing his own situation and his own predicament. And therefore, then, his specific speeches have the poetical quality actually that refer back to the beginnings of Genesis. Right? Then we want to conclude this lecture with a really interesting look at who Job is. And on one hand, who Job is really obvious at the outset of the story. The story tells us who Job is, or rather, what kind of man he is. The opening verse of the story makes it very clear. It says, "There was a man from Uz, his name was Job, and this man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil." Right? So what kind of man is he? We also want, and it states it very clearly. But then we're going to see him put through his trials and tribulations, in which we're going to have to determine the truthfulness or the fidelity of this statement to this character, right? And whether he remains the upright Job, right? In particular, we also need to characterize the type of person he is within a society. He's a person of a certain standing, a certain wealth, a certain success. Now, these words aren't exactly used. Success is our word. But when you see it, what he has and the life he's been living, you see that he is a respected man within the community. And this tension between his relationship with God, on the one hand, and his relationship with his community, and his own relationship with his own wealth, creates a dichotomy between two fundamental aspects of human identity which are on display in the text, and begin to raise the question of which we care about more, which defines us more, which we are more loyal to. And to answer the question of who is Job, we have to answer a more general question of what is or what makes a man or a woman. You know that expression, what makes a man? It's not the clothes that makes the man. What are the things that define us as individuals? What defines you as an individual will establish, or the criteria will establish what you think the person essentially is. And the story, or you could say the moral of the story, gives us a very clear answer of what are the elements, what are the criteria, what are the attributes that should define the human being in their essence, right? And the interesting thing is, as we look to all of the literature in this course, is we're going to see these same questions with different answers, And this question of, you could say, what makes the man, or what is the worthy element of the human being, this is a question put not just to this character, but it's put to us. What defines us? What should define us? What are the things that we should value? And by determining or establishing what we should value, we're in essence defining our own identity as individuals. So let's get into this. So before we look directly at Job, I just want to make a few comments on the context within which this text comes out of. This story is a traditional tale told about a good man who loses everything. This kind of story is a kind of traditional tale, by which I mean it's universally told, as the specific features of this type of tale differ for one society and another. There is the tale of the good man who suffers, and raising one of the fundamental questions is why is he suffering? Does he really deserve to suffer? If he doesn't deserve to suffer, then why? It's a mystery. But this particular telling of this, the Jewish or the Hebrew version of this story, is very much woven into the history of the ancient Hebrews, and therefore the plight of this man becomes a kind of microcosm for the plight of the Jewish people on a whole. Therefore, the trials and tribulations Job suffers are understood as parallel in miniature of the individual to the trials and tribulations of the Jewish nation at large. So let's just reestablish some very important basic facts that many of these we've talked about many times now. But the Bible comes out of a region of the world, Mesopotamia, in which is their pantheistic religion. And of course, the Hebrew Bible is predicated on being the revealed word, not of many gods, but of one God. And the development of monotheism establishes some interesting problems for explaining the nature of the world and for explaining the nature of human history and human experience and events, problems that pantheistic religion doesn't have, which is to say, now we have a single God who is the cause of everything in the order of things. And to raise the claim that God has caused suffering or done evil presents a great challenge under the premise that God is good, God is all-powerful, God is just, so on and so forth. Again, we're going to see a type of God, like we saw in Genesis, that's highly personalized, anthropomorphic. This is a God with psychology. This is God with a God with an ego. And we have to understand, why does Job undergo this suffering? And one important point about the suffering that Job goes through is that he does not know what is going on behind the scenes, or we should say he does not know what's going on up in heaven, that explains why he is suffering. There's what's called, we'll come back to this term, dramatic irony. But dramatic irony means that the audience or the reader is aware of a central fact that is causing things to happen in a story or to characters that the characters themselves are unaware of. A fact that the characters are unaware of, but we see. For example, we know why Job is suffering, at least on one level of causation, which is that God and Satan have made this, for lack of a better word, they've made a wager with one another, and therefore that precipitates Satan making Job suffer, right? And the important point of view to understand is when Job begins to suffer, he does not see what the reader is able to see, having initially gone on in heaven. All he sees is his own suffering. And then he asks the question, why me? What's going on? And this question then precipitates his friends coming and attempting to answer that question. And of course, they have a very specific opinion on why Job is suffering. But we'll see with this wager between Satan and God that God really has a personality here that's very much human, and it doesn't seem perfect in our eyes. And this is the kind of mysterious way of God. If we read God's personality on paper, it seems less than perfect. And yet, our active faith dictates that we say God is perfect. That is the challenge, one of the challenges being presented here. So, part of the goal of the Bible for the Jews, apart from simply telling themselves who they are and how they should live and what this world is and how they relate to it, in greater specificity is to explain the plight of Jewish history. And of course the Bible, the first 5 books in particular, are almost nothing but the story of the Jewish nation. And what occurs in the story of the Jewish nation? Various trials and tribulations that they can only attribute to the one God, the good God, rather than some enemy God of another nation that might inflict pain and suffering on them, precisely because they don't recognize those other gods as real gods. They are simply false idols. So that means they have to attribute all their challenges to their God. What is the central problem, the historic problem of the Jewish nation that is trying to be explained in the Bible? It's this cosmic homelessness, first of mankind, with the exile from the garden, but then later the cosmic homelessness or the wandering or exile, the diaspora of the Jewish people. Right? What do I mean by cosmic homelessness? Home is not just where you live, it's where you belong. Home is not just a place, it is a place that establishes your identity, and your identity is rooted in it and connected to that. You uproot the person from the place, and the whole certitude about their identity and the substance of their identity is at the very least, if not changed, it's called into question. So obviously this happens when Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden. They essentially become exiles or refugees. They're wandering the earth, trying to reestablish that harmonious relationship that they had in the garden between place and their identity that becomes the struggle of human life in general. In particular, the Jewish nation suffers this circumstance numerous times throughout their history, but particularly with something called the Babylonian captivity. In which they are forcibly exiled from their homeland in what is modern, more or less modern day Israel. And they're taken captive under the Babylonian Empire, the 5th century BC, and it's called the Babylonian captivity. The Babylonian captivity. And the question is, what was the logic behind this forced exile, right? And diaspora. Diaspora literally means a kind of a spreading out, a kind of people get exiled from their homeland and they're forced to kind of be atomized to the winds, they're scattered across the planet or across the known world. The idea was to destroy the Jewish nation. The Babylonians had long been at odds with the Jews, and the solution then was, if you really want to eliminate them as an adversary, you take them off their homeland and you disperse them to the winds, a basic strategy of divide and conquer, right? And those people are going to go off, and what's going to happen? They're not going to be Jewish anymore. They're just going to assimilate to get by. They want to live, right? Most of all, most people want to live. So they're not going to hold on to their ancient ways, and they're going to just simply assimilate to other cultures, and their Jewishness will be destroyed as a product of this dispersal or diaspora, right? So ironically then, this is the moment that the Bible comes in its final canonical form. So what becomes the strategy for the ancient Jews to preserve their religion, preserve their heritage and their identity? It is to bring that identity into a canonical book, and then to become the people of the book. So if we don't have our homeland, we have our book. And our book, unlike our homeland, can go anywhere with us. You might even say that the Hebrew Bible is their homeland. Okay, so the book becomes the unifying feature of Jewish life, and therefore interpreters, rabbis have seen the suffering of Job as a kind of parallel microcosm to the suffering of the Jewish people that occurred under the Babylonian captivity, right? So, which is just to say this, that there are many ways this story can be read. It can be read in relationship to the historical context, or it can be read as a story, a kind of moralizing, didactic story that is to teach a lesson or have a moral to mankind at large, which is how we're going to approach it. But it's important to understand the kind of Hebrew-Jewish origins of the meaning of this story within that historical context. So now what I'd like to talk about is the specific structure, the way the story is written. And to understand that, we have to look at the section or body of writings from which this story comes. And it comes from something called the Ketuvim. And this is the third division of the Hebrew Bible, the latest, like the most modern, the most recent, which is to say, it comes together around the same time as the Babylonian captivity and hundreds of years after the final form of Genesis, right? We tend, because the Bible is claimed as being a revealed text, we tend to think of it as being revealed all at once. Well, once we start looking in the history, we see that it comes together in bits and pieces in the same way that when you look at all those stories together, you can actually really see that they are kind of bits and pieces anthologized and interpolated into one text. So what is the Ketuvim? The word Ketuvim just means writings, and that is because there is a diversity of types of writings within the Ketuvim itself, including poetical books, which includes Job, the scrolls, and history. So we have a series of a kind of miscellaneous collection of liturgical poetry, which reminds us that we're looking at a kind of anthology that is kind of squished together, taking on its final form between the 6th century and 2nd century BC, so actually fairly recently. And here you can see just how these books or sections fit together. The Tanakh is just an acronym for the Torah, T, Nevim, Na, and the Ka is the Ketuvim. So here we see the three divisions of the Hebrew Bible. Let's look at the literary structure of Job. We said we're going to analyze texts, right? Analyze text. And analysis means to break something down into its component parts. And we said that the basic elements by which we can break down a text into its component parts is form and content. We said form is structure, and content is the substance, essentially the substance of what's said or the meaning. So we could break that down in a kind of parallel way and speak of plot, which is the substance, and form, which is how that substance is conveyed to us, right? We said the content is the what and the form is the how the what is told, so to speak. So let's for a moment talk about what the plot of this story is. Here we've got Job on the left. We've got his wife in the background, a more minor character. So this painting really goes a long way to illustrating the actual content of the plot, right? So ancient painting, pre-modern painting, like before the 20th century, was really geared toward telling stories. And you can see the way in which the painter, they know the story. They don't just have a general idea, but they are trying to embed in their painting what they can't. They try to make it a moving image, despite the fact that it's not. And this painting tells us a whole lot. So what's the basic story? At the outset of this tale, we've got Job, the upright man. He's very wealthy. We'll see how that's depicted in the story in a moment. He has a lot of children. He appears to, although it's not overtly stated, he appears to have respect within his own community precisely because, what's the word we're going to use? He's a successful man. But he is also upright, a pious and devout man. And this already raises the issues surrounding how we define human identity, or what counts, what matters to us, what do we value in our life. And the story is going to ultimately bifurcate in what we value between faith in God, love of God, fear of God, obedience to God, versus our love, loyalty, and attachment to worldly things. So what happens to this man who is both upright and pious, but also has achieved a lot of worldly success? Well, Satan and God get together up somewhere in the heavens, and they have a conversation. Do you see the upright Job down there? And God seems to be kind of admiring his work. He says, look at this great creature I've created down there, and he follows my will obediently. And he doesn't say he's rewarded for it, but he seems to have been rewarded for it because he's living a pretty great life. Of course, it's not everybody who's pious is wealthy, and not everybody who's wealthy is pious. And in fact, I think we might be inclined to think that people who are very successful in this world are maybe less than pious. So Satan says, oh really, God, you think this creature of yours that you made is so great? Well, does Job fear God for naught, or does Job fear God for nothing? We'll talk about specifically what that really means, because it's actually not obvious what he's saying there at first. It's rather elliptical, and we need to kind of go through the stages to figure out what he's saying. But nonetheless, God and Satan enter into effectively a wager, a kind of a bet, to see how Job responds to all his worldly possessions being taken away from him. And by worldly possessions, I mean his cattle, his crops, his house, but then also his children, then also the love of his wife, and in general, his reputation. And in terms of the things of this world, after Satan has taken away as much as he can, he has lost everything. He has nothing. And God says one thing to Satan, that's the rule in this bet. He says, do whatever you want to Job, but do not take his life. So his life is the only thing he gets. But what kind of life is it when it's this miserable? I mean, Job himself is going to say, I wish I wasn't alive anymore, because I have no reason to live. Life is not worth living when I'm in this condition. And the question is, how is Job going to respond? What matters to Job? Is it the worldly possessions, including other people and relationships with them? Or is it his relationship with God? So the plot, right? So he has everything taken away, and then he goes through this ritual of rent and tearing his clothing, stripping himself naked, putting ashes on his head. He's on the ground. He's humiliated. And in the midst of this ritual, he has three friends show up. He has Bildad, Eliphaz, Zophar. Now, frankly, I guarantee you that each one of these figures that we're looking at here is supposed to be specifically connected to each one of those characters. And I have labeled them just to label them. I don't know which is which, honestly, and I don't know how the artist here went about deciding that. But the point is, he's suffering, and he raises the basic question that is the cause of philosophy, it is the cause of the Bible and religion, and it is the thing that human beings ask that science cannot answer, that is one of the central themes of this course, that these myths attempt to answer, which is why. Why me? And the three friends, with three slightly different points of view, three different backgrounds, what are they going to do? Well, three different people with three different points of view, they're going to interpret differently, right? So each one of them attempts to give an answer as to why. And the interesting thing is, they're all certain they know. They're all certain they know what's going on. And so what ensues after the prologue or exposition is a back and forth dialogue to try to answer this question, where they start with opinions and they try to establish the real reasons for Job's suffering. The text concludes with the emergence of God to rectify and bring to closure this argument and to render a verdict about the cause of these things. But in the process of dealing with the why question, God has something to say on the very act of them raising these questions and assuming they know the answers to the questions they have raised, because the questions they're really asking about are questions about God's ways and God's reasons and God's thoughts behind why he does what he does in the world to people like Job, right? And God has something very important to say about their attempt to understand God's ways. Now, this is important to keep in mind, that the Hebrew God, the Christian God, the God of Islam, this God is mysterious. This God works in mysterious ways. This is a God that is a being beyond time and space, right? This is a God that to the human mind and to human reason is ineffable, which is to say, not fully intelligible to the human mind, not fully intelligible to human reason. What is the crown jewel of the human being? It seems to be reason. This is the special thing that differentiates us from other animals. It seems that God maybe even wants us to use this capacity. We do pick the fruit, and he seems to know that that's going to happen. And we go off, picking the fruit is the utilization of our reason and our ingenuity and our curiosity, and that leads to the whole development of civilization, which can be considered the product of human ingenuity or the faculty of reason. So here God wants to raise a question about forget about what the answers to their questions are, about why God did this. He raises the problematic specter of their right to even try to understand his will and his ways, right? And in essence, when God emerges at the end, out of the storm, out of the whirlwind, it's quite spectacular. And you'll notice something, that the story climaxes. The climax of the story is at the end with the emergence of God, right? He raises the specter of their right to even attempt to understand his ways. And then you say, well, what else would they do? I mean, why wouldn't they? That's natural human impulse to try to understand his mysterious ways and why am I suffering? And so here's the point. This is the natural consequence of something like this happening to a man like Job. The first question is why? It's our natural impulse, right? So of course we ask that question. And God seems to say, wait a second, right? God condemns our desire and curiosity to know his will. Then the question is raised, what is the alternative? And obviously the text answers that pretty unequivocally, right? The moral of the story becomes very clear, right? Because the moral of the story ends up being not just how Job handles his suffering, but there is a moral about the very fact that they're inquiring, kind of trying to peer under the surface about the nature of his suffering, which is a result of God's will to begin with. We've got a grasp of the plot or the content. Let's look at specifically the literary structure here, which is to say there is a U-shaped plot. And by that I mean, very simply, Job's life starts out at the top. It's the best it can be. Then he hits the bottom, rock bottom. He's lost everything. You might say he has nothing, and he is a nobody. But then what happens at the end, once God has emerged? Job gets it all back, and he gets it all back with interest, right? So he starts from here, he loses everything, and then he gets it all back, and even a little more so, right? So what's interesting about there's something very perverse about the tragedy of this story, and yet at the end, he ends up with more than he had at the beginning. And it's a very different type of story in that structure compared to, say, Greek tragedy. The story of Greek tragedy is of a larger-than-life, superior human being, of greater virtue than the ordinary human being, a virtuoso, a being who's not quite perfect, but much more perfect than we are. They suffer a great and calamitous downfall in the course of their existence, and they do not get it back. And at the end of the story, very disturbingly, they're at the bottom. There is not a happy ending in Greek tragedy, ever, right? There is only the awareness at the end of a Greek tragedy that even great people, people superior to the viewers of the spectacle, of the drama, even those people fall. And there is no, you might say, redemption from their fall. But by Job getting everything back, we have this kind of U-shaped plot that's very different from Greek tragedy. And what's interesting is Greek tragedy and the book of Job, these stories are being developed and, in the case of tragedy, performed around the same time as each other in an age in which there is a fair amount of intercourse between the world of the Near East and the world of ancient Greece. We see a pretty classical narrative structure in which there's diegesis and mimesis. We all know diegesis is narration, and mimesis is imitated text. And you'll see a narrator and a narrative structure that is much more clear and explicit than what we saw in Genesis, where there's really mysteries about the nature of the narrator and what's going on there. And this seems to have a lot to do with the fact that this later story is just the beneficiary of more sophisticated and developed strategies for telling a story, and simply that storytelling technique is developing and likely influenced by sources outside simply the ancient Near East. Here is this great image of Job, who is at the peak of his suffering. Everything has been taken away. He's practically naked, and he even has sores and boils on his skin. Because what do human beings love the most? They love what's theirs. They love their money. They love their dog. They love their house. They love their job. They love their own opinions. And most importantly, they love their own lives and their own bodies because they're theirs. And it's... Think about it. When there's pleasure, we prefer our pleasure to someone else's because it's our body that gets to experience it rather than them. Because if they experience it, we can't appreciate it. We can't feel, we can't enjoy that pleasure directly. So the second go-round, remember there's two go-rounds where Satan takes a few things away at first, and then he cuts to the core, he cuts to the bone, and he tries to harm his flesh. And this comes back to the flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, these references to Genesis 2, where Adam and Eve are attached to one another, and Adam is in a sense attached to himself because Eve comes out of his side or out of his rib, and therefore this really addresses the theme of self-love. So this is just a really great image. I was trying to find some good images here. So just to make the point, Genesis, the structure, is elliptical, condensed, and poetic, whereas we see a very different, more expanded structure in Job. And that structure becomes very clear. We start out with a prologue or exposition. And you should always ask yourself, in this paragraph, or in these series of paragraphs, what is the function of them? What is the author trying to communicate? Without getting in the specific substance of what it is, what in general, what are the types of things that they're trying to communicate or establish? In the prologue, we have the establishment of the setting, and in fact there's going to be two settings. We have the establishment of the characters and what they're like, and we also have the emergence of the conflict. Then we have dialogue, and you'll notice the structure really shifts, because the narration almost completely drops out, and we have mimetic conversation between Job and his friends. And you'll notice even more specific that it's almost like very clear that they're sitting around in a circle like a campfire, and Job speaks, and someone else responds. Job speaks, and then another character responds. Job speaks, and then the third friend responds, and it goes in a kind of order. It's almost like they're in almost like a political context, and they're following like protocols of speech. They're following a certain ritual, and you'll see that it's highly structured in those chapters that deal with this conversation. Then the third part, we get to the climax, where actually we could say this is still part of the dialogue, but with the emergence of God in this dramatic moment, and him bringing all those conversations to a head, a kind of closure, kind of conclusion, we separate it out, and God comes in to be the definitive arbiter and interlocutor of this situation, where he has entered this dialogue, and he is also going to bring that dialogue to a close and to clarify some things for these human beings with their reason, groping in the dark, trying to figure out why Job is suffering the way he is. Just step through for a moment in greater specificity what each section provides us in terms of structure. So the prologue establishes the nature and identity of the main characters. And obviously at the center is Job, but also we should say lurking there is the nature of God and Satan. We get a couple lines that give us a little juicy bit about Job's wife and her relationship with him, and maybe why she even likes him so much, all in one line. It's quite stunning. Then we start to get, or we will get, information about the friends, but that really comes up more clearly in the dialogue. We learn about them when we see their opinions on why Job is suffering. What is an opinion? It's a reflection of your own experience and your own point of view, your own emotions, so on and so forth. We get the setting and situation, and there turns out to be two settings. This is really important. The two settings are human beings down on earth and God and Satan somewhere in the heavens. I mean, who knows where they really are and how you do this stagecraft. But they're not beings of this world, and therefore they're not occupying the world of Job, and therefore this is the key thing, what happens with them is unbeknownst, and what goes on with them is completely unbeknownst to the characters down below. Now, this establishes a very common paradigm of setting that we're going to see in the Odyssey, which is that in the Odyssey, there's human beings inhabiting this world we're all familiar with, and then there are the gods on Mount Olympus, and the gods on Mount Olympus are the puppet masters pulling the strings of humanity, right? I mean, this story reminds us what is the cause of human action, what is the cause of human history. It's not human beings. Human beings don't make their own history. It's God's providence. And what is God's providence? It's God's will working through human history, in which the cause of events are really his will and not our own, right? So when we look at the Odyssey, we're going to see gods like Zeus and Athena and Poseidon up in the heavens making decisions for people down below, and then we're going to see the people down below, and those people down below are not going to be fully aware of the decisions that are being made from on high. Very clear, this prologue goes from chapter 1, verses 1 to 12, and where we get the circumstances and identity of Job. And then at chapter 113, the end of chapter 2, we get the tragedy of Job depicted. Now, here's my argument, which is, given the brief brevity with which this tragedy is described of Job, we discover that it's really not the central focal point of the whole story, right? And then at chapter 4, we get the introduction of the friends and the beginning of the dialogue. And what I'm arguing is that the first 3 chapters is really just an introduction to the main substance of the story, which is not about human action, at least in the sense of deeds and doing stuff. The real action of the story is speeches. And this conversation, this really almost a philosophical meditation on why Job is suffering. This is, to ask the question of why is to ask a philosophical question, right? And to be in conflict with the central message of the Bible, which is not to ask questions, but to, what does it mean to be pious? It means to fear God. It means to be obedient to God. It means to love God. And if you're asking questions, you're not following those kind of core protocols. So then we get to the dialogue and the dialectic, right? Dialogue literally means conversation between two or more people, right? Dia means two. You think of dialogos. It's literally speeches back and forth between people. And we think of the root word logos there. Logos means an account or an explanation. And what do these speeches represent? Each character's attempt to explain Job's situation, right? This is important. These explanations rotate, right? And they're a dialogue, but they also have an echo of something that's developing in ancient Greece, a form of argument, and it's something that's later coined by Plato. And so this is, I'm kind of projecting this term back on this text, but I'm also anticipating things we're going to read later, which is to say Plato and his dialogues. Something Plato calls dialectic. And dialectic is actually just a fancy word for a dialogue, but a dialectic specifically is a type of dialogue in which there is a question-answer process in which an initial opinion is posed. I believe this, right? And then the other character says, well, this doesn't seem accurate to me. I criticize that. I refute that. Can you reformulate what you're saying and make an argument that actually I could accept as correct or true? And a dialectic is a conversation that moves, therefore, from opinion to truth by a process of question, answer, and vetting or interrogating an initial opinion and getting the main speaker to revise their point of view till they get to a statement that seems more consistent with the truth once it's been kind of interrogated. And this should call to mind to you essentially a rudimentary form of the scientific method, which is about proposing a thesis and then making sure that that thesis or that hypothesis is consistent with the facts of the world. Right? Here they don't do it through a science experiment, but they do it through question and answer and criticism in the form of speech. Right? And you'll notice something, just lastly, interesting about the structure of these speeches is that in many ways these speeches stand alone. Job keeps lamenting his own situation, whereas the other characters respond. They claim to know why Job is suffering, and they constantly frame their answers in the form of the way God works. The way God works. God works in this way, and therefore that's why you're suffering now. And I don't want to give it all away, but that basic structure. The climax and conclusion is from chapter 38 on, and God presents himself to Job and friends to provide a definitive answer to their questions, and he becomes the final arbiter of truth. Now think about this for a second. If you're a philosopher, if you're a scientist, the arbiter of truth is evidence and logic. Those two things are distinctly mortal things. They are this worldly things. They are things not of the heaven, but of the earth, right? And we modern people, I would say in general, at least in public, your private point of view might differ, but in public we trust the science, right? Trust the science. That's the mantra these days. And therefore, we expect disputes to be resolved in reference to facts and logic of this that are of this worldly order. Logic, again, is rooted in things like cause and effect and logical consistency, which again are phenomena, they're extrapolations of the material world, the earth as opposed to the heaven, right? Or the heavens. What's the problem for the Bible? What you all know what the problem is in philosophy, if you've ever taken philosophy course. They've been asking the same damn questions for 2,500 years, and they ain't got the answers yet. And if they don't got the answers yet, they ain't never going to get the answers, right? Philosophy says, okay, we're just going to keep plowing ahead. But the Bible says the reason you don't have the answers is not because you haven't had enough time for the test. It's that your reason is attempting to answer things that it cannot possibly answer, right? The ultimate truth of things in the Bible is something that is not comprehensible to the human being. And therefore, it's only faith in God, loyalty to God, fear of God, obedience of God, and simply accepting what he tells us. As a parent, the parent says, don't ask that question, just do what I say, right? Because, right? So God comes in here to shut down rational discourse precisely because the Bible presents it as a kind of ultimately futile discourse. It wants to answer these core questions. We think we can answer these questions, but God says no. And it's not because there's anything it's not that you're not trying hard enough. It's not that you're not smart enough. It's that reason simply cannot answer these kinds of questions. And of course, when we look to the Greeks, we look to Socrates and Plato. He's not going to fundamentally completely disagree with that, but the locus of authority is not going to be a God upstairs. It's going to be something a little different. So now that we've got the structure, let's just look at a little bit of the prologue, which is the focus today. We're going to look at the dialogue between the friends and God's intervention later. Let's just read it. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. So what does a pious man look like? They're perfect, they're upright, and they feared God and eschewed evil. And this raises the question of what it means for the biblical world. What does it mean to be perfect? When we look at the Greek world, we're going to see a different standard of what constitutes perfection or virtuosity or virtue, right? It seems that he's perfect precisely because he is pious, right? And the Greeks are going to have a very different conception. And it's important. We've got the same question, what is human perfection, but we've got different answers. We've got different answers. And your first question should be, is the narrator telling us the full story here? Is Job perfect? Is he perfectly pious? Well, we might say he hasn't gone through his trials and tribulations yet. Let's see what happens when Satan makes him suffer, and we'll see if he remains perfect. Because, perfect is not what are you on a good day. Perfect is what have you done on all the days of your life. Perfect is what have you done under the greatest pressure and under the greatest duress. Have you lived up to perfection? Right? And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. So he's got 7 children, men for the days of the week, and 3 daughters, makes 10, right? And then it says his substance also was 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of them all of the East. So this word is so beautiful here. Substance. Substance. What, and I raise the question, what constitutes Job's substance? Right? What constitutes his substance in this paragraph? Right? Here, when the word substance is used, it seems to explicitly refer to his material substance, aka his wealth or material wealth. And in this world, he is a rich man. And not only is he rich, he seems to be celebrated. I mean, he's the greatest of them all, but there's the implication that other human beings in his community at large, in the East, celebrate him as being and having all these things, right? And I mean, it's interesting, in the East, when Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden, they live in the East, right? So we're in a realm that is not utopian. We're in the real world here. So there's a great essay by Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, called Being and Having. Being and having. And of course, Sartre, in his own inimical way, says what matters of a human being is what they are and not what they have. It's a kind of, in his text, it's a kind of anti-consumer, anti-capitalist, anti-materialist in the sense of economic materialism. And it's matter what the true substance should be, you and your character and your deeds, right? So we're going to use this word substance as maybe referring either to his character as a human being and what he is in his being, and also in another sense to refer to what he has, right? And that's going to be the great tension established here, because we see in verse 1 that he has a pure soul, and in verse 3 he has lots of stuff in this world, possessions that are possessions of the body, directly and indirectly. Okay, so let's continue. We're not going to read everything here, but what I do, you notice at verse 5 that he makes offerings on the premise that his kids might have done something wrong, but he's not actually aware of it. I mean, it says a lot about human beings that, number one, they've probably done something wrong, and number two, you're not aware of it because they don't tell you. So human beings in this world can be sneaky and conniving, just the way Adam and Eve conceal themselves. They try to conceal their crime from God, when they pick the fruit from the tree. So what does Job do? He's so good that he makes sacrificial offerings to God to compensate for their potential sins that he's not even aware of what they might be. Right? That's like a really good guy. We should also be aware that, making sacrifices also is a demonstration of one's wealth. Like here, they're literally sacrificing animals, and a burnt offering is a cooked animal, right? So this is the world where they make, sacrifices of animals. A common thing in the ancient world. But then we get to verse 6. Up till now, the setting has been in the land of Uz, and Uz is on earth, and earth is below heaven, and it is the mortal realm, the physical realm, right? But at verse 6, now there was a day. I mean, first of all, what kind of day is that up in heaven? It's like a day with a capital D that's not like our days here on earth. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, who apparently is the son of God, one of them, came also amongst them. So this is the first appearance of Satan in the Bible. And instead of like thinking about the devil with the pointy tail and the fork, the trifork, let's just look at what's here. What's the portrait of Satan here? And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. Now, this is another funny thing from the Lord. Like, doesn't the Lord know where Satan was? Just like shouldn't he have known what Adam and Eve were up to when they tried to hide themselves? They shouldn't have been able to succeed, right? So there's another mystery that like this God is not fully cognizant of everything that goes on. And there's obviously a lot of different ways you can interpret that. But on the most superficial level, he's forced to ask Satan. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. And he's later on described as the blameless Job. So what is a perfect man here? There's actually a definition. And a perfect man who is upright is one that fears God and eschews or avoids evil. And I would say eschews evil is even stronger than avoid. It's you could say it's like condemns evil, right? And we see that in his sacrifices. Is this who Job really is? Well, now God is telling us, not just the narrator. You see the difference that God has just basically repeated the language of the narrator in verse 1. Then Satan answers the Lord and says, Doth Job fear God for naught? Now, what does that mean? Does Job fear God for naught? That's an interesting question. We're not going to answer that now. But let's just be clear here. Starting with verse 6, we have established a clear and distinct second setting. A world in which Satan and Lord God are having a conversation, a dialogue, and ultimately make a wager about this servant Job. And Job is completely oblivious to what's going on here. He's not in on the wager. This is kind of like politics today. Can you only imagine what politicians do in back rooms that affect you and your life? And they claim things are being done for one reason, but in a back room they just cut a deal and what's happening to you, what's happening in the nation is a very, very different reason. So we've established these two settings, and these two settings establish dramatic irony, which is a circumstance in which we, the audience or the reader or the spectator, is aware of something that something material, something important that the character is not aware of. So Job is not aware of what's going on here. So what is the conflict? I mean, we don't want to answer it in class, but the conflict is interesting. I mean, Job suffers. Now, on one hand, that seems to be the conflict. But this raises the question, why does he suffer? It raises the question of what the point of it is all about. And we could raise this question, is Job being punished? Is Job being punished? Now, the Friends provide an answer to these questions. And it might turn out that the conflict is something other than what we might think it is. Obviously, one question is being raised is, why do good men suffer? Why do good men suffer? Right? And think about it. If you're an ancient Greek at a certain point, the answer to why good men suffer is very easily because of fortuitous chance nature. Shit happens. People get cancer for no good reason. It's not divine will. But here all answers have to come back to the cause of divine will. And Satan asked this question, does Job fear God for naught? And what is that? Does Job fear God for nothing? Does he have no good reason for his fear? Because we know that he's a God-fearing man, which is virtually synonymous here with piety, right? Does Job fear God for nothing? And this ultimately, skipping a few steps of explaining this statement, is going to have to do with why people do the right thing when they do the right thing. And you realize that when you think about what motivates human beings to do the right thing, we realize that there's actually more than one motivation for doing it. Job is the blameless Job. Job is the perfect and upright Job. He has done the right thing. And this statement, does Job fear God for nothing, raises the specter of exactly why he does the right thing. And we're going to save the answer to this for the classroom. So to conclude now, part 3 of this lecture, I want to talk about what makes a man, or what makes a human being a human being. And by that I don't mean like body and soul, or our bodies and our biology, or that's part of it. But what do we value? Where is our worth to be found? And how do we, as individuals, understand our own identity? And our own identity has to do with what we care about and what we cherish and what we value. Because those things we cherish and value, we pursue, and we become those things, right? So this has to do with this whole question of what makes a human being. Has to do with what are the key characteristics or criteria we use to determine the identity of a human being, and the criteria we use to determine their worth. Job, at the outset, has two kinds of substance. He has substance of character or faith, and he has substance of this world, of the body. Material well-being, a great family, a healthy family, a flourishing family, a great house, lots of wealth and resources. But it turns out a human being, as presented in ancient literature, and still even today in various forms, is divided between a body and a soul. And we might say that there are two answers to what makes a human being, and one lines up with the concerns and needs of the soul, and the other lines up with the concerns and needs of the body. What defines a man or woman? Is it their inner or their outer substance? Their inner substance is the nature of their soul, right? Their outer substance has to do with the stuff they have in this world. So this kind of lines up in some ways the distinction between being versus having. It's slightly different. So this raises the question, do the clothes make the man? Which is another way of saying, do you judge a book by its cover? And the problem is, many of us will say that, oh, no. Some of you just sell it. Yeah, oh yeah, it's the clothes, of course, whatever. And then other people say, no, it's not the clothes that make them. It's the book. It's not the cover of the book. Or as Martin Luther King said, it's not your race, color, or creed. It's the content of your character. And the content of your character would be understood as the inner substance of a human being, right? The problem is, imagine, let's take Job here. What happens to him? All his outer substance is removed from him. Every last thing that he could care about, that he loves, and not only that, everything that gives him status within his own society to other people is taken from him. Now, when you have all that taken from you, you will discover what you really care about. And I suppose for most people the answer is obvious. I care about myself, I care about my family and my friends. When this litmus test of having everything taken is really, because we all say nice things, I'm compassionate to everyone and so on. But it raises the central theme of the central motivating force behind all human beings, which is self-interest and self-love. Self-interest meaning I do things to benefit myself or my own interest, and self-love meaning, number one, I love things that are mine, and I love things that are like me, because I can relate to them better than things that are not like me. So, it's a kind of an egotism, but it's not necessarily something fundamentally negative, right? And you realize it's not negative if you had your whole family taken away from you, and that by a God who you fear and obey, and then ask yourself, how do you feel about that God who just did that, right? So then we ask, what is Job's substance? And there's a perspectival thing here. There's Job's substance as he understands himself, and there's also as people perceive him, right? Obviously, he seems to have a perfect soul, and he's also got a perfect material life. But we're really going to see his substance in the way he responds to everything being taken away from him, in which he has nothing, number one, and number two, he is nobody to everybody else. Now, this raises an interesting question. He's a nobody. His wife's not happy. Let me tell you, he's a nobody to her. But who shows up? These friends. They say some really tough stuff. And it raises the question, do you really think they're his friends? Well, one answer rhetorically is this, like, who shows up for him in this time of being nobody? And the ritual he goes through, which is kind of representative of Shiva, it's like he's memorializing his own death, because he has died a certain mortal death. He's physically alive, but in terms of his relationships with the world he had, his life he had, he's dead. And you might actually say that these are three really great friends, because while they're tough with him and they don't agree with him and they criticize him and accuse him, they nonetheless show up when he has nothing and treat him with respect and dignity, even in their kind of tough love statements. So we'll find out what Job's substance is once he goes through this. You might call it a test. So Augustine really established these two aspects of mankind's identity. You could say a spiritual inner identity and a material external identity. And he summed them up in the concepts of the inner man and the outer man, or the inner woman and the outer woman, meaning your spiritual, and the outer meaning your material identity. And he says the inner person lives within the realm of the city of God, which is a spiritual realm, and your body lives within the city of man. So you have two identities, and then you have two cities or two homes in which each identity resides in, right? And where did he derive this idea? Which is Augustine's writing in the 5th century A.D., after the death of Christ. And he's a theologian who comes much later than the story of Job. But what you see in the story of Job is a foreshadowing of ideas that were clarified by Augustine. And by taking his ideas, we can then apply them back on the story of Job and really get clarity on what's going on here. In Matthew 22:21, he says something that most Christians know by heart. You render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and you render unto God that which is God's. Right? Caesar gets your patriotic attachment. He gets your taxes in particular, but God gets your soul. The state, or the ruler, Caesar in this case, has no right to your soul and to your ultimate spiritual loyalties. Your body is regulated and controlled in this world by the political rulers. Caesar is really either a ruler, or it's just a metaphor for the state or the government that rules you. And then, of course, your faith, your piety goes to God, which is to say this, that for Christians, the state is not divine. For Christians, Caesar is not a god, because in Roman thought, many Caesars presented themselves as gods that you were supposed to worship. Right? For Christianity, God is always above the state and above the leaders. Right? That's why whenever you see a leader being kind of deified, you should be wary. It's much better when our leaders are criticized, because at least they're treating them just like human beings rather than gods or anointed ones. Okay, so the city of man, what does he mean by that? I mean, he literally means the city, like civitas. It's the realm of the human body. It's where human bodies live. And since it's the realm of the body, it's the realm of sin. And therefore, if it's the realm of the body, the city is driven by the body and its needs and desires. And those needs and desires rule the city. In this realm, man is a corporeal being controlled and regulated by a political order. And in this order, the highest form of existence is to be a good citizen of the regime. So how do you be a good citizen? You pay your taxes, you mind your business, you pay your bills, you pay your parking tickets, and just stay out of the way. And you do that out of necessity to get by, but it's not the ultimate goal of one's life. It's just the necessary precondition for your spiritual relationship to God. Therefore, the city of God is the realm where the human soul resides. And of course, this city is an immaterial city. It's a spiritual reality that pervades the city of man. It's there, you just have to know what you're looking for. This city is an immaterial realm of the soul. Its citizens are those who hold faith with God and therefore indifferent to the needs, demands, and desires proffered in the worldly realm of the city. Right? So when we talk about desires of the city, of man, we're talking about things like wealth, success, reputation, worldly power, political power, etc., etc., etc. What then is more important than life as a citizen and loyalties to the city? What's more important? It's loyalty and faith to God. So think about it. Let's go back to the story of Adam and Eve. They're supposed to hold faith with God. They're supposed to have fear in Him. They're supposed to be obedient to His commandment. And when Adam is forced to explain, God forces him to explain why he ate the fruit, he said, You gave me Eve, this woman, and she made me eat of it, right? What is he saying in part? My loyalties are to my wife in this world versus to you, God. I mean, he actually just tells God that. And in fact, he implies, God, you gave me this worldly being to attach myself to, and therefore I attach myself to her, and of course I didn't follow your commandment, right? So you see the fundamental nature of this tension between the city of God and the city of man. It's most profoundly reflected in the tension between Abraham and Isaac, the story of Abraham and Isaac, in which God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, and your son is literally your flesh, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, and if self-love is the principle of the material world of the city of man, it is the primary thing that you're attached to. What greater act of devotion and faith than being willing to sacrifice your own flesh in the form of, in this case, your own child, right? So this is the kind of tension we're talking about, and you can see just how profound and how serious it really is. This is a dilemma. This is like the ultimate dilemma. The human being gives his faith despite all the... So here's the problem with faith. We give this faith despite all the challenges and conflicts it causes within the city of man, which creates conflicting priorities and loyalties. So what's the whole problem with the dilemma? You've got two principles or two desires that are equally worthy of adherence to, and choosing between them becomes then therefore very hard. And being a person of faith becomes a challenge in the city, which is dedicated to things that are not about faith. Okay, so as we round third and head home here, just to illustrate what we're talking about here, there were in the ancient world called stylites. The word stylite comes from, I guess it's Latin stilo. Literally it means column, right? Or tower, right? There were people in the ancient world who would erect these towers in like a town square and then live in them. And this is actually where we get the expression ivory tower. Ivory tower refers to academia, however you want to pronounce it, in which academia isolates itself from like the common sense hustle and bustle of the commercial world, of the street in New York, what have you, and they elevate themselves to this higher, more pure intellectual realm that's disconnected from the hustle and bustle and the moral and some of the moral and political implications of this world. So we use that today, but originally the ivory tower meant these people called stylites who would literally erect these towers and live in them, literally to separate themselves out from the city of man and all its desires, and they would live in them as ascetics, right? So an ascetic is someone who self-abnegates and gives up all these desires of the body, which are understood as connected with the life of the city of man. And here they are trying to demonstrate to the rest of the world and themselves that there are higher callings in life than these material goods, right? And they are trying to live a life, you could say, literally closer to God, a life of piety, of faith, and demonstrating that by giving up all these worldly goods. The whole origins of the kind of monastic life, in many ways, have their fundamental impulse in this tension between these two worlds and this giving up of worldly pleasures like sex, like money, wealth, power, etc., etc. What this all illustrates, this tension between the body and the soul, between the inner life and the outer life, between the city of man and the city of God, it all reflects our nature. And it all is right here. The Lord formed man from the earth and breathed a living soul into him. Mankind is an amalgam of heaven and earth. And what did I say at the beginning, looking at the nature of man in Genesis 2? That this is the source of the tension, this is the source of the problems of human existence, and there is ultimately a tension in choosing one versus the other, right? And that these two don't synthesize. It's like having a little bit of life of faith and a little bit of life of the body. Like it just doesn't seem to work because they seem to be mutually exclusive in some interests. They conflict naturally with one another. And the Bible seems to try to drive that point home. So Augustine spoke of the inner man and the outer man. So we all know this today. We have a version, a secular version of, the inner beauty of the person versus the outer. So here's a guy in a green suit. It's like even maybe representative of his wealth. But what we really care about is not the cover of the book, but the substance of it. And here's some things Augustine said about this distinction between the inner and outer man. And it raises the question, once we've defined these two, the question is for you, which one matters? And how do you manage the two, given that they're actually in tension or conflict with one another? He says the inner man and the outer man are not the same. When we speak of the outer man, we speak of the body. The inner man refers to the rational soul only. They are different, but they come together in one person, right? So that's the tension. The human individual is a walking conflict. The outer man view. If you take only into account the outer self, the only difference between human beings and beasts is that humans stand upright. So you see his implication that the human animal bodily is an animal like all others, driven by impulses and desires, right? So partly what Augustine is concerned with here is the dignity of man. And the dignity of man comes from that we have a soul that is the primary thing that differentiates us from animals. Therefore, if you want to live a distinctly human life, you have to live a life guided by the soul. And for him, that's a mixture of kind of rational thought, but also ultimately faith. And Augustine has an interesting attempted synthesis between the kind of the rationalism of the Greeks and the faith-based life of the ancient. The biblical or the Augustinian point of view, the inner man represents your true life, your faith, your intentions, right? And that you should therefore not judge a book by its cover, but by its content. And here's the key thing. The inner man is something that's not seen, but it's the reality. Whereas the outer man or the outer human being is just an appearance, and that's the thing that's seen with the eyeball. The outer man is one exists as a human self only insofar as one is seen, is heard, and carries on public relationships with one another. And it's the locus of political action and wealth and so on. So you can see very clearly the tension here in Job. Asking yourselves, where do I fit in this question about what counts for me as a human being in my own identity? Well, here Hannah Arendt just illustrates, political philosopher and so on, but here she illustrates the vast difference between the biblical point of view to the Greek point of view. We are much closer in many ways to the Greeks in our modern world, in America, in the 21st century, than we are to the biblical view, at least in public. And so there are the interesting tensions that emerge over trying to categorize us to where we fit. But look at how she describes the Greek point of view. And the Greeks care about the outer man. She says, the outer man, which is the human being, is everything that appears in public and can be seen and heard by everybody and has the widest possible publicity or public appearance. For us, appearance is reality. It's the truth. Something that is being seen and heard by others as well as by ourselves, for the Greeks, constitutes reality. So we need only think of social media as just one of a vast array of examples in which we strategize a public image that then establishes our own identity and our own self-worth in this world. And with something like social media, we've all become kind of celebrities, crafting and preening and contriving an image that is then presented to the public, and that becomes the reality out in the world. Oh, here we go again. To conclude, let's just look at this outer self. Even establishing its boundaries, we'll see what the challenge is for Job when we read this statement by William James, his Principles of Psychology, which address with what is the nature of the self? This is really the question we're asking. What is the nature of the human being? It's where its worth is to be found. We would say in the 21st century, what constitutes our self? And he talks about an empirical self. And if he's talking, empiricism has to do with taking in evidence from the senses, or it's the world of the senses. So clearly what James is talking about here is not an inner self that is a spiritual relationship with God, for example, but he's talking about a material self. He's talking about our lives in the city of man, so to speak. And he starts to illustrate that the boundaries between who you are and what you have become incredibly blurry. And here's the thing, for Job, what he has is going to be taken away. And by what he has being taken away from him, it's not just taken away physically from him, but it's starting to, you could say, deconstruct his own identity, or obliterate his own identity in the process of those things being taken away. And so James says this: the empirical self of each of us is all that he is tempted to call by the name of me. Right? And what do we call by the name of me? All the things we possess. Now this is the tension. Remember, Jean-Paul Sartre, he says, being versus having. Right? It's about being and it's not about having. Well, the problem is, what you have is also what you are. So how do you square that circle? How do you make that distinction between being and having? It seems to be a problematic distinction to begin with. But it is clear that between what a man calls me and what he simply calls mine, the line is difficult to draw. So me is who I am, and mine is what myself owns or has. But the problem is that distinction between having something and being something is not absolute. In fact, it's a continuum of connectedness. He says, in the widest possible sense, however, a man's self is the sum total of all that he can call his. Not only his body and his psychic powers, but his clothes and his house, his wife and his friends, his ancestors, and his friends, his reputation and his works, his lands and his horses, his yachts and his bank accounts. Who are they talking about? It's definitely not me. All these things give him the same emotions. If they wax and prosper, he feels triumphant. If they dwindle and die away, he feels cast down. Not necessarily in the same degree for each thing, but in much the same way for all. Think about this. If what we are is what we have, then as we get more stuff, which is to say wax, increase, or prosper, we feel triumphant, we feel good. Think about this. If they dwindle, these things we have dwindle and die away, we feel cast down. So what's happened to Job? Things are taken away from him, and he feels cast down, because it's like when someone dies and we say, part of me has died, right? It's not just people, it's also our things, our effects, our things that are close to us. So, as things are pulled away from him, he dwindles, he's literally cast down. Now imagine this. How about if every important thing in this world is ripped from you? What are you then? And I think the answer in Job, within the context of the city of man, what you are is precisely nothing, or precisely nobody. You live, but you have nothing to support or to give substance to your identity, either in terms of respect for yourself or in the reputation others might have of you and the respect they give to you. So what you tell me, what matters? The stuff of this world or the relationship one has in the city of God?